The scream came before the smoke did. Mira Hale ran through the trees with her lungs burning and her bare feet cut open by roots and stone. Behind her, the village of Ashwell was no longer a village. It was fire eating wood, fire eating roofs, fire eating the only home she had ever known. She did not look back. Looking back had already cost her mother 3 seconds, and 3 seconds had been enough for a clawed hand to close around her mother's arm. She kept running. The forest around Ashwell had always been friendly to her, full of soft moss and familiar paths, but tonight, it felt like a stranger, closing in from every side. Branches clawed at her face, her chest screamed for air. Somewhere far behind, she could still hear the low growls of wolves that did not belong to her pack. Wolves painted in the colors of a rival clan that had wanted Ashwell's land for years, and had finally decided that words were no longer worth using. By the time the sun rose, Mira had nothing left. No home, no family she could find, no pack to call her own. She walked for 2 days on legs that shook with every step, surviving on wild berries and rainwater caught in leaves. She did not cry. She had promised herself, somewhere in the smoke and noise of that night, that she would not cry until she was safe. She was not safe yet. On the 3rd day, exhausted and half-starved, she saw the towers of Blackthorn Keep rising above the tree line like gray teeth against the sky. She had heard of Blackthorn before, in stories told around fires by traders who passed through Ashwell. It was the seat of the Alpha King, a wolf pack so strong that even the boldest enemies thought twice before testing its borders. She did not know if the king would help a stranger with nothing to offer. She did not know if he would even let her through the gates, but she had no other direction left to walk in, so she walked toward the towers instead of away from them. The guards at the gate were tall and unsmiling, their eyes flicking over her torn dress and bloodied feet, with a mixture of suspicion and something close to pity. She told them her name, told them where she had come from, told them what had happened to Ashwell. One of the guards, a broad-shouldered man named Colin Marsh, studied her for a long moment before nodding toward the inner courtyard. "The king doesn't take in strays for free," Colin said, not unkindly. "You'll need to work. Can you fight?" "No," Mira admitted. "Can you track, hunt, heal wounds?" "No," she said again, feeling smaller with every answer. Colin sighed, the sound of a man who had seen this before. Refugees arriving with nothing but the clothes on their backs, and no skill to trade for shelter. He rubbed the back of his neck, and finally said, "Kitchens are always short-handed. Talk to Grace Bell. She runs the ovens. If she takes you, you'll have a roof and food. If she doesn't, I can't promise you anything more." It was not a warm welcome, but it was more than Mira had expected, and she thanked him, with a voice that cracked from thirst and exhaustion. The kitchens of Blackthorn Keep were loud, hot, and utterly unforgiving. Grace Bell, a stout woman, with flour permanently dusted into the creases of her hands, looked Mira over the way a butcher looks over meat that might be spoiled. "You've never worked a kitchen in your life," Grace said. It was not a question. "No," Mira answered honestly. She had learned quickly that lying to people who could smell fear and deception in the air was pointless. Wolves, even the human-shaped ones, always seemed to know. Grace clicked her tongue and pointed to a mountain of unwashed pots stacked near the back wall. "Then you'll start there. Prove you can work before you ask to cook anything worth eating." For the first week, Mira scrubbed pots until her fingers wrinkled and cracked. She hauled water from the well before dawn. She carried firewood until her shoulders ached in ways she had never known shoulders could ache. The other kitchen workers, a tight group of women who had grown up together in the keep's shadow, did not go out of their way to make her feel welcome. They whispered about her burned village when they thought she could not hear. They called her the girl from nowhere, the stray Colin dragged in off the road. Mira said nothing. She had learned, in the space of a few terrible days, that surviving mattered more than being liked. It was on the 10th night that Grace finally allowed her near the actual cooking, though only because half the regular cooks had come down with a fever that swept through the lower halls. Mira was handed a knife, a pile of vegetables that had seen better days, and instructions to make something the wolves returning from a long patrol could eat before collapsing into their beds. She did not know the fancy recipes the other cooks used. She did not know the proper way to season meat the way Blackthorn's wolves liked it, heavy and rich with spices imported from the southern trade roads. What she did know What she had learned from her own mother standing over a much smaller fire in Ashwell was how to make something warm out of almost nothing. Bones simmered slowly. Vegetables added at just the right moment, so they softened without turning to mush. A pinch of salt, careful and exact, not thrown in carelessly the way the tired kitchen staff usually did when they were rushing to finish their shift. She burned the first batch. The smell of scorched broth filled the kitchen, and Grace shouted at her loud enough that half the hall probably heard. Mira apologized, scraped the ruined pot clean, and started again with what little was left of the evening's ingredients. This time, she watched the fire the way her mother had taught her, small and patient, never letting the flames rise higher than they needed to. The second pot did not burn. It simmered quietly in the corner of the kitchen, while Mira finished her other chores, filling the room with a smell that was simple but somehow comforting, the kind of smell that made tired shoulders relax without anyone quite noticing why. When the patrol wolves came stumbling in from the cold, mud on their boots and exhaustion carved into their faces, they expected the usual thin stew that the kitchen threw together on nights when nobody had the energy for anything better. Instead, they were handed bowls of something that smelled like home, though none of them could quite say whose home it reminded them of. The first wolf to taste it, a young man named Owen Vance, who had only recently earned his place among the King's patrol, stopped mid-sip and stared into the bowl, as if it had spoken to him. He did not say anything at first. He simply finished the bowl in silence and asked, quietly, if there was more. There was more, though barely enough to go around. Every bowl that night was returned scraped clean, something that almost never happened in a kitchen, used to feeding wolves, who ate out of necessity, rather than enjoyment. Mira noticed the empty bowls stacking up by the wash basin, and felt a small, cautious warmth spread through her chest, the first good feeling she had allowed herself since the night Ashwell burned. Grace noticed too, though she said nothing about it directly. She simply told Mira, gruffly, that she would be cooking again the following evening. Word moved quickly through Blackthorn Keep, the way word always moves quickly, among wolves who share senses sharper than most humans could imagine. By the second evening, more wolves than usual found reasons to linger near the kitchen doors. By the third evening, there was a line. Mira did not understand why her simple soup, made from scraps and patience rather than expensive spices, had caught the attention of an entire pack of warriors who had eaten in far finer halls than this one. She assumed it was simply hunger, or curiosity, or the kind of passing interest that would fade within a week once the novelty wore off. She kept her head down, kept working, kept making the same careful broth night after night, never adding anything unusual, never doing anything she could not explain. But the whispers continued to grow. Some of the older kitchen staff began muttering about strange gifts, about healer bloodlines rumored to exist in villages far from Blackthorn, about soups that could calm even the most restless wolf. Mira dismissed all of it. She was not gifted. She was not special. She was simply a girl who had lost everything and had nothing left to offer except the one skill her mother had managed to pass down to her before the fire took everything else away. She did not know, on that 10th night, that her small pot of soup had already been noticed by someone far more important than tired patrol wolves. She did not know that news of it had reached the private study of the Alpha King himself, a man who trusted almost nothing that arrived at his gates without a price attached, and who had already begun asking quiet questions about the girl from the burned village who had somehow, without meaning to, made his wolves crave something as ordinary as soup. For now, Mira only knew that her hands were raw from work, her feet were finally healing, and for the first time since the fire, she had slept through an entire night without dreaming of smoke. She woke before dawn out of habit, built from years of helping her mother start the morning fire, and she found herself standing in the quiet kitchen alone, staring at the pot she had scrubbed clean the night before. The other cooks would not arrive for another hour. The hearth was cold, waiting to be lit. Outside, the courtyard was still dark, the towers of Blackthorn barely visible against a sky just beginning to lighten at the edges. Mira pressed her palm flat against the cold stone of the hearth and allowed herself, just for a moment, to remember her mother's hands doing the same thing every morning in Ashwell. The memory hurt, sharp and sudden, but she did not push it away this time. She let it settle, let it remind her why she had chosen to keep walking, instead of giving up somewhere in that endless forest. She had lost her home. She had lost her family, but she had not lost the one thing her mother had given her that fire could not burn, and wolves could not steal, the simple knowledge of how to turn almost nothing into something warm enough to matter. Grace arrived not long after, rubbing sleep from her eyes and grumbling about the early hour, but she stopped short when she saw Mira already kneeling by the hearth, coaxing the first flames to life with the same careful patience she had used on the soup 2 nights before. "You're up early," Grace said, surprise evident in her voice. "I couldn't sleep," Mira answered simply. Grace studied her for a long moment, the same assessing look she had given her on the first day, though something in her expression had shifted slightly, softened at the edges. "The wolves are asking for you again tonight," she said finally. "By name, if you can believe it. A stray from nowhere, and half the patrol wants to know your name." Mira did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing at all. She simply nodded, turned back to the fire, and began preparing for another long day of work in a kitchen that had, against every expectation she carried with her through the burning forest, slowly started to feel less like a stranger's territory, and more like the first fragile threads of something that might one day resemble a home. She did not yet know that the king himself had begun watching from the shadows near the kitchen door some evenings, curious and guarded in equal measure. She did not know that her quiet soup, made without any intention beyond simple survival, was about to change the direction of her entire life. All she knew, standing there, with flour dusted across her hands, and the fire finally catching in the hearth, was that she had survived one more night, and tonight, she would cook again. The days that followed fell into a rhythm Mira had not expected to find so quickly. She rose before the sun, lit the hearth, and worked through chores that never seemed to end, yet somewhere in the middle of the exhaustion, she found small pockets of comfort. A kind word from Owen Vance when he returned an empty bowl. A nod from Colin Marsh when he passed through the courtyard. Even Grace, gruff as she was, had started leaving a little extra bread near Mira's side of the counter, without ever admitting to it out loud. Not everyone in the kitchen felt the same warmth toward her. A woman named Edith Cole, who had worked the ovens at Blackthorn for over a decade, made her dislike of Mira known in small, sharp ways. She would move ingredients just before Mira reached for them, forcing her to search twice as long. She would comment loudly to the other cooks about strays who thought a lucky pot of soup made them special. Mira bit back every response that rose in her throat. She had learned long ago that fighting battles she could not win only wasted energy she needed for battles that mattered. One evening, as the kitchen prepared for the nightly meal, Edith cornered her near the pantry. "You think because a few tired wolves liked your soup, you belong here," Edith said, arms crossed, voice low enough that only Mira could hear. "You don't. You're a burned-out girl from a village nobody even remembers the name of. The moment the king finds someone with real talent, you'll be back on the road where you came from." Mira did not answer right away. She simply gathered the onions she had come for and turned to leave, but at the doorway, she paused. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly, "but until that day comes, I'll keep cooking, and I'll keep doing it well." Edith had no response for that, and Mira walked away with her heart pounding harder than she let show on her face. That night, as she stirred the broth over a low flame, she noticed a change in the way the wolves gathered near the kitchen entrance. There were more of them than the night before, standing in small clusters, talking in hushed voices, glancing toward the pot, as if it held something more valuable than simple vegetables and bone. She recognized most of the faces now. Owen was there, along with a quiet young woman named Ivy Marsh, Colin's younger sister, who had recently returned from her first long patrol, and looked thinner and more tired than Mira remembered. Ivy took her bowl with shaking hands, and sat near the wall, sipping slowly, her shoulders gradually loosening with each spoonful. Mira watched her from across the kitchen, feeling something she could not quite name. It was not pride exactly, though there was pride mixed into it somewhere. It was something closer to purpose, a feeling she had not experienced since the last night she cooked beside her mother in Ashwell. Later, after the wolves had eaten, and the kitchen had quieted for the evening, Grace approached her with an odd look on her face, somewhere between confusion and reluctant respect. "You know the wolves are saying things about that soup of yours," Grace said, wiping her hands on her apron. "What kind of things?" Mira asked, bracing herself for another version of Edith's cruelty. "That it settles them," Grace said. "Calms the ones who come back from patrol, wound tight as a bowstring. Ivy Marsh hasn't slept a full night since she came back from the border. Not until she had a bowl of your soup tonight." She's already asleep in the barracks, first time in weeks according to her brother. Mira did not know how to respond to that. She had not added anything unusual to the broth, nothing beyond the same simple ingredients she had always used, the same slow, patient fire her mother had taught her to trust. I don't understand it, she admitted honestly. Grace shrugged, though her eyes lingered on Mira, a moment longer than necessary. Maybe you don't have to understand it. Maybe you just have to keep doing whatever it is you're doing. Mira nodded, though a small worry had already begun forming in the back of her mind. She had not asked for attention. She had not wanted to be noticed, not in a place where being noticed for the wrong reasons could mean being sent away, or worse, being seen as a threat by people far more powerful than tired kitchen staff. She thought of the burned village behind her, of how quickly safety could be taken away, and she promised herself she would be careful, that she would let the soup speak for itself and nothing more. She did not know, as she banked the fire and prepared to retire for the night, that a tall figure had been standing just beyond the kitchen's side entrance for the better part of the evening, hidden in the shadow of the stone archway, watching the wolves come and go with bowls in their hands. He had not announced his presence. He rarely did when he wanted to observe something without changing it through his presence alone. His eyes had followed Mira's movements around the kitchen with a quiet, careful attention that few people in Blackthorn Keep would have recognized, because few people had ever seen the Alpha King watch anything so ordinary with such focus. Draven Ashcroft had ruled Blackthorn for nearly a decade, since the sudden and violent end of his father's reign had forced him into leadership far earlier than he had ever expected. He had built his pack into one of the strongest in the region, through discipline, caution, and a refusal to trust easily. Lessons he had learned the hard way, after a betrayal, early in his rule, had nearly cost him everything. He did not concern himself with kitchen gossip. He did not usually notice which cook made which meal. But when 3 separate reports reached him within the same week, each describing wolves calmed and steadied by a simple pot of soup, made by a girl with no pack and no name anyone recognized, his instincts, sharpened by years of watching for threats hidden behind ordinary faces, told him this was worth seeing for himself. He left the archway before Mira noticed him, disappearing back into the corridors of the keep, with more questions in his mind than he had carried in a long while. He did not yet know what he had witnessed. He only knew that something about the quiet, tired girl scrubbing pots in his kitchen had unsettled the careful order of his world, and Draven Ashcroft did not like unsettled things left unexamined. Mira, unaware of the eyes that had watched her that evening, banked the last of the fire and walked back to the small room she shared with 2 other kitchen workers, her body aching in the familiar way it had ached every night since she arrived. She lay down on her thin mattress and closed her eyes, and for the second night in a row, she did not dream of smoke or fire or the sound of her mother's scream cut short. She dreamed instead of nothing at all, a deep and dreamless rest that felt, for the first time in weeks, like something close to peace. She had no way of knowing that peace was only the beginning, and that the soup she had made from scraps and memory was already changing the course of everything that would come next. The kitchen door slammed open with enough force that every cook inside froze mid-motion, and Mira nearly dropped the pot she was carrying when she saw who stood in the doorway. Draven Ashcroft filled the frame of the entrance, the way storm clouds fill a sky, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark eyes sweeping across the kitchen, with an intensity that made even Grace Bell, who had run this kitchen for 15 years without flinching for anyone, take a small step backward. He said nothing at first. He simply walked forward, past the frightened cooks, past the trays of half-prepared food, until he stood directly in front of the pot, simmering quietly over the fire, the same simple broth that had caused so much whispering throughout his keep. "Which of you made this?" he asked, his voice low and controlled, the kind of calm that was more unsettling than shouting would have been. Nobody answered immediately. Mira felt every eye in the kitchen shift toward her, and she understood, with a sinking feeling in her stomach, that there was no point in hiding. "I did," she said, stepping forward despite the way her legs wanted to carry her in the opposite direction. Draven turned to look at her fully for the first time, and Mira found herself unable to look away from his gaze, sharp and searching, as though he were trying to read something written beneath her skin. "You're the girl from the burned village," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she answered. "Tell me what's in this soup." Mira blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness of the demand. "Vegetables," Bones for the broth, salt, nothing more than that. Nothing more, Draven repeated, his tone edged with disbelief. My wolves have been requesting this soup by name for over a week. One of my patrol members slept through an entire night for the first time since a border skirmish left her shaking every evening. You expect me to believe that vegetables and bone broth accomplish that? Mira felt heat rise to her cheeks, though whether from embarrassment or something closer to indignation, she could not say. I don't know why it works the way it does, she admitted honestly. I only know how my mother taught me to cook, and I've done nothing different than that. Draven studied her for a long moment, long enough that the silence in the kitchen stretched uncomfortably. Grace shifted her weight beside the ovens. Edith Cole watched from the corner, with poorly hidden satisfaction, clearly hoping the king's suspicion would end in Mira's dismissal. Bring me a bowl, Draven finally said. Mira hesitated only a moment before doing as she was told, ladling a portion of the broth into a wooden bowl, with hands that trembled slightly, despite her best effort to appear calm. She handed it to him carefully, watching as he took it without breaking eye contact with her, as though he expected her to flinch or reveal some hidden guilt in the exchange. He did not eat it immediately. He lifted the bowl to his face and inhaled slowly, the way a wolf tests unfamiliar prey before committing to anything further. Mira held her breath. She knew, somewhere in the back of her mind, that if Draven Ashcroft decided this soup was dangerous, decided she was dangerous, her time at Blackthorn Keep would end that very night, and she would be back on the road with nothing, exactly as Edith had predicted. Finally, Draven took a single spoonful. The kitchen seemed to hold its breath along with Mira. She watched his expression carefully, searching for any sign of what he might be thinking, but his face remained carefully neutral, giving away nothing. He took a second spoonful, slower this time, and something in his shoulders shifted, so subtle that Mira almost missed it. The tension that had carried him through the door, the sharp readiness of a man expecting a fight, eased by some small but noticeable degree. He set the bowl down on the counter without finishing it, his expression unreadable once more. There is nothing unusual in this, he said finally, though his tone carried less certainty than his words suggested. No poison. No enchantment that I can sense. I told you, Mira said quietly, allowing herself the smallest measure of relief. That doesn't mean nothing is happening, Draven added, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her again. I don't understand it, and I don't trust things I don't understand, especially not within my own walls. I'm not trying to deceive anyone, Mira said, meeting his gaze, despite every instinct urging her to look away. I came here with nothing. I lost my home, my family, everything I had ever known. All I have left is what my mother taught me, and cooking is the only way I know how to survive. If that has somehow helped your wolves rest easier, I'm glad, but I promise you, there is no trick behind it. Something flickered across Draven's face at the mention of her lost family, something that might have been recognition, or perhaps something closer to old memories surfacing unwillingly. He did not comment on it. Instead, he straightened, resuming the composed authority that seemed to be his natural state. I will be watching, he said simply, before turning and walking out of the kitchen as suddenly as he had entered, leaving behind a room full of cooks, who did not dare speak until they were certain he was well out of earshot. Grace exhaled loudly, pressing a hand to her chest. Well, she said, I suppose that could have gone worse. Edith, disappointed that nothing more dramatic had come of the confrontation, muttered something under her breath, and returned to her work without another word. Mira stood frozen for a long moment, her heart still hammering from the encounter, replaying every second of the king's visit in her mind. She had expected fear when facing him. She had expected the kind of terror that came from standing in front of someone powerful enough to end her fragile safety with a single word. What she had not expected was the strange, unsettled feeling that lingered after he left, the sense that something about his gaze had reached further than simple suspicion, as though he had been searching for something in her that had nothing to do with poison or enchantment at all. She pushed the thought aside and returned to her work, telling herself that the king's suspicion, however unsettling, was preferable to being ignored entirely. As long as he had not ordered her removed from the keep, she still had a place here, however uncertain that place remained. That evening, when the wolves gathered again near the kitchen entrance for their nightly meal, Mira noticed a new face among them, standing slightly apart from the others near the far wall. It took her a moment to recognize him without his earlier intensity, dressed now in simpler clothing, rather than the formal coat he had worn during his visit, his presence far more subdued than it had been hours earlier. Draven had returned, though this time he did not announce himself with slammed doors or pointed questions. He simply stood near the wall, watching the wolves receive their bowls, watching the way their shoulders loosened after the first few spoonfuls, watching Mira move between the fire and the counter, with the same tired efficiency she had shown every night since her arrival. She noticed him almost immediately, but she said nothing, unsure of what protocol required when the Alpha King chose to linger silently in a room, rather than issue commands. She simply continued her work, ladling soup into bowls, handing them to wolves, who thanked her with genuine warmth that had grown more comfortable with each passing night. When the last of the wolves had been served, Draven approached the counter, and Mira braced herself for another round of questioning. Instead, he simply asked, "Where did you learn to cook like this?" The question caught her off guard, softer than she had expected from a man who had barreled through the kitchen doors only hours earlier demanding answers. "From my mother," she said. "She used to say that good food didn't need to be expensive or complicated, it just needed patience." "Your mother," Draven repeated, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "Is she still with your old pack?" Mira's throat tightened, and for a moment, she considered giving a simple, evasive answer, the kind she had given to anyone who asked too many questions about Ashwell. But something about the directness of his gaze made her want to answer honestly, even though honesty meant reopening a wound she had barely begun to close. "She died the night our village burned," Mira said quietly, "along with most of the people I grew up with." Draven's expression shifted, the careful neutrality cracking just slightly to reveal something that looked almost like understanding, though he offered no words of comfort, no soft apology that might have felt hollow coming from a man who had greeted her that very afternoon, with suspicion rather than sympathy. He simply nodded once, a small acknowledgement that seemed to carry more weight than any lengthy condolence could have. "I lost my own family young," he said finally, his voice quieter than Mira had heard it before. "Not to fire, but to betrayal, from within my own pack. I understand what it means to rebuild from nothing." Mira did not know how to respond to that unexpected admission, so she said nothing, allowing the silence between them to settle into something less tense than it had been earlier, though still far from comfortable. "I will continue watching," Draven said after a moment, though his tone had lost the sharp edge of suspicion it carried hours before. "Not because I believe you intend harm, because I have learned, through hard experience, that everything within these walls deserves careful attention, especially the things that change my pack in ways I don't yet understand." Mira nodded, accepting the explanation for what it was, an admission of caution rather than accusation. "I understand," she said. Draven studied her a moment longer, then turned and left the kitchen without another word, leaving Mira alone, with her thoughts, and the dying embers of the evening fire. She did not know what to make of the conversation, the strange shift from suspicion to something quieter, something that felt almost like the beginning of understanding between two people who had both learned, in their own painful ways, what it meant to lose everything, and keep standing anyway. She banked the fire for the night, unaware that across the keep, in his private study, Draven Ashcroft sat awake far longer than usual, turning over the memory of a burned village and a mother's death, and wondering why the story of a girl he barely knew had settled so heavily against a heart he had long ago convinced himself was closed to such things. A crash of thunder shook the shutters of the keep, and Mira jumped so hard she nearly spilled an entire pot of broth across the stone floor. Storms had frightened her ever since the night Ashwell burned, though it was not the thunder itself that unsettled her, but the memory of smoke curling upward into a sky, just as dark and heavy as tonight's clouds. She steadied herself against the counter, forcing her breathing to slow, and continued stirring the pot as rain began hammering against the kitchen's narrow windows. It had been nearly 2 weeks since Draven's first visit to the kitchen. 2 weeks, in which his suspicion had not vanished entirely, but had softened into something Mira could not quite name. He had not returned with the same forceful energy of that first confrontation. Instead, he had begun appearing quietly, almost unnoticed, standing near the same spot by the wall each evening as the wolves gathered for their meal, watching without speaking, leaving before Mira finished serving the last bowl. At first, she had assumed his presence was simply continued surveillance, the careful watching of a leader who trusted nothing without proof. But as the pattern repeated night after night, always at the same hour, always with the same quiet stillness, she began to wonder if something else was drawing him back. Tonight, with the storm rattling the windows and thunder rolling overhead, she did not expect him to appear at all. Most of the pack had already retreated to their quarters, unwilling to brave the rain for a meal they could easily eat once the weather passed. Only a handful of wolves remained in the dining hall, huddled near the fire, their bowls mostly forgotten as they waited out the storm. She was surprised then, when the side door opened and Draven stepped through, rain dripping from his dark hair, his coat soaked through from whatever business had kept him outside during the worst of the weather. He looked tired in a way Mira had not seen before, the careful composure he usually carried worn thin at the edges. "You're still cooking," he said, more observation than question, as he moved toward the fire to warm his hands. "The wolves on the eastern wall haven't eaten yet," Mira answered, ladling a portion of soup into a bowl without being asked. "I didn't want them coming back to nothing after standing watch in this weather." Draven accepted the bowl she offered, his fingers brushing briefly against hers as he took it, a small contact that neither of them acknowledged aloud, though Mira felt an odd warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the kitchen's fire. He sat on one of the wooden benches near the hearth, uncharacteristically informal for a man who usually commanded every room he entered, and ate in silence for several long minutes, while the storm continued to rage outside. Mira busied herself with cleaning, giving him space, though she found her attention drifting toward him more often than she intended. She noticed the tension in his shoulders slowly easing with each spoonful, the same subtle shift she had first noticed weeks ago, when he tasted her soup for the first time. It fascinated her, this quiet transformation, though she still could not explain why something as ordinary as her cooking seemed to calm him the way it calmed the rest of his pack. "Does it always work like this?" Draven asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "What do you mean?" Mira asked, turning to face him. "My wolf," he said, his voice lower now, almost hesitant, as though admitting something he did not often share. "It's restless most days, always alert, always ready for the next threat, the next betrayal. It rarely settles, even when I sleep. But when I eat this," he gestured toward the bowl in his hands, "it quiets, just for a while. I don't understand why." Mira considered the question carefully before answering. "My mother used to say that food made with patience carries something of the person who made it. Maybe it isn't magic, maybe it's simply care, something most people don't take the time to put into what they cook anymore." Draven studied her for a long moment, the firelight casting shifting shadows across his face. "Care," he repeated, as though testing the word for truth. "I haven't experienced much of that, not in a long time." "I'm sorry," Mira said softly, unsure of what else to offer. "Don't be," he said, his voice carrying a rare note of something almost like vulnerability. "It isn't your fault that trust doesn't come easily to me. I've had reasons to guard against it." Mira wanted to ask what those reasons were, curiosity pulling at her, despite every instinct telling her it was not her place to pry into the private wounds of a king. But something in his expression, tired and unusually open in the dim firelight, made her hesitate to push further. Instead, she simply nodded, allowing the silence to stretch comfortably between them, rather than filling it with questions he might not be ready to answer. They sat like that for a while, the storm gradually softening outside, the fire crackling low in the hearth, until Draven finally set his empty bowl aside and rose to his feet. "Thank you," he said, the words simple, but carrying more weight than Mira expected from a man who rarely offered gratitude so plainly. "You're welcome," she answered, watching as he moved toward the door, pausing briefly with his hand on the frame. "I'll be back tomorrow evening," he said, not quite meeting her eyes as he spoke, as though the admission cost him something to voice aloud. "The same time." Mira felt her heart give an unexpected flutter at the statement, though she quickly reminded herself that his continued visits were likely still rooted in caution, rather than anything more personal. Still, something about the way he said it, quiet and almost reluctant, made her wonder if there was more to his presence than simple oversight. "I'll have soup ready," she said, and something in his expression, the smallest hint of a smile, that vanished as quickly as it appeared, told her that her answer had pleased him more than he cared to admit. True to his word, Draven returned the following evening, and the evening after that, establishing a quiet routine that neither of them spoke about openly, but both seemed to understand without needing words. He would arrive after most of the pack had already eaten, sit near the fire, share a bowl of soup in comfortable silence, and occasionally ask small questions about her life before Blackthorn, about Ashwell, about her mother, questions Mira answered honestly, grateful for someone willing to listen without pity clouding their expression. In turn, she learned small pieces of his own history, fragments he offered carefully, as though testing how much trust he was willing to extend. She learned that his father had ruled with an iron grip that left little room for softness, that his own mother had died when he was young, leaving him to be raised largely by pack elders, who valued strength over warmth. She learned that a betrayal years earlier, one he refused to discuss in detail, had taught him to guard his trust as fiercely as he guarded his borders. Neither of them named what was happening between them, the quiet evenings by the fire, the gradual ease that had replaced the initial suspicion, but the kitchen staff noticed regardless. Grace watched the pattern develop with a knowing look she kept mostly to herself. Edith, predictably, muttered complaints about favoritism to anyone who would listen, though even she eventually grew tired of a rumor that seemed to bother no one else in the keep. Owen Vance, who had been the first wolf to taste Mira's soup weeks earlier, mentioned to Colin Marsh one evening that the king seemed different lately, calmer, less prone to the sharp temper that had defined his early years of rule. Colin, watching his king share quiet evenings with the girl from the burned village, only smiled and said nothing, though he suspected he understood the reason better than most. Mira, for her part, tried not to read too much into the growing familiarity between herself and the Alpha King. She reminded herself daily that she was a kitchen worker, with no standing, no bloodline worth mentioning, nothing to offer a man who ruled over one of the strongest packs in the region, beyond simple soup and quiet company. She told herself the visits meant nothing more than what they appeared to be, a tired leader, finding brief respite in a small kindness during difficult days. But some nights, when Draven lingered a little longer than necessary, when his eyes held hers a moment past what conversation required, she wondered if the careful distance she had built around her heart since the fire was beginning to crack, slowly and without her permission, in ways she was not entirely prepared to face. Outside the walls of Blackthorn Keep, far beyond the reach of firelight and quiet evening conversations, old enemies were beginning to stir, drawn by rumors of a girl who had escaped their attack on Ashwell and found shelter in the last place they wanted her to be safe. But within the kitchen, wrapped in the warmth of simmering broth and unspoken understanding, Mira remained unaware of the storm gathering far beyond the one that had already passed, focused instead on the strange, fragile comfort of evenings that had begun to feel, despite everything she had lost, like something worth holding on to. A hand gripped Mira's wrist so tightly she nearly dropped the tray of bread she carried, and she spun around to find Ivy Marsh staring at her with wide, frightened eyes. "Someone was watching the Eastern Road last night," Ivy whispered, glancing over her shoulder, as though the words themselves might summon danger. One of the border scouts saw markings burned into a tree near the old crossing, the same markings the raiders used on Ashwell. The tray in Mira's hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy. She set it down carefully on the nearest counter, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the sudden hammering of her heart. "Are you certain?" "Colin confirmed it himself this morning," Ivy said. "The king has already doubled the eastern patrols." Mira swallowed hard, memories of smoke and screaming rising unbidden in her mind. She had allowed herself, over the past weeks, to believe that Blackthorn's walls were thick enough to keep the past from reaching her. Now that fragile sense of safety felt suddenly, terribly thin. "Does the king think they're coming here?" Mira asked. Ivy hesitated before answering. "Nobody knows for certain, but there are rumors that the raiders who burned Ashwell have been asking questions about a girl who survived. Your name has come up more than once." The words settled over Mira like a weight she could not shake off. She had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that the raiders who destroyed her village might eventually learn she had survived. She had simply hoped, foolishly perhaps, that enough time and distance would keep her forgotten among the many other refugees scattered by their violence. She returned to her work that day with hands that trembled slightly more than usual, though she said nothing to Grace or the other cooks about the fear tightening in her chest. The kitchen, usually a place of noise and distraction, felt suddenly too quiet, every sound outside the walls sharpened by her heightened awareness. That evening, as she prepared the nightly meal, the whispers among the gathered wolves carried a different tone than the appreciative murmurs she had grown accustomed to. Now, alongside compliments about her cooking, she caught fragments of conversation about strange scouts near the border, about markings that matched old enemy symbols, about the increased patrols stretching the pack's resources thin. Owen approached her counter later than usual that night, his expression more serious than she had seen it before. "You should know," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one else was listening. "Some of the wolves are saying your soup isn't just good cooking anymore. They're saying you carry some kind of gift, something passed down through healer bloodlines that most families lost generations ago." Mira frowned, uncertain how to respond. "I don't have any gift," she said. "I've told the king the same thing. It's just cooking, made with care and patience, nothing more mysterious than that." "Maybe," Owen said, though his tone suggested he was not entirely convinced. "But you should be careful. Gifts like that, real or imagined, attract attention. Not all of it kind." Mira thought of the burning markings near the eastern road and felt a chill settle over her despite the warmth of the kitchen fire. She thanked Owen for the warning and continued her work, though her mind remained elsewhere for the rest of the evening, circling around fears she had hoped to leave behind in the ashes of Ashwell. Draven did not appear that night, called away by urgent matters related to the increased border activity, and Mira found herself oddly disappointed by his absence, more unsettled by the empty space near the fire than she expected to be. She banked the hearth alone, the quiet kitchen feeling larger and colder without his familiar presence occupying the bench near the flames. Over the following days, the whispers about Mira's supposed gift continued to spread, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Some claimed her soup could heal wounds faster than the pack's trained healers. Others insisted she carried the blood of an ancient line of forest witches, capable of calming even the most volatile wolf temper, with nothing more than careful seasoning. Mira denied every version of the rumor she encountered, but denial seemed only to fuel further speculation, rather than quiet it. Grace, observing the growing gossip with her usual sharp eye, finally pulled Mira aside one afternoon, while the kitchen was quiet between meal preparations. "You need to understand something about wolves," Grace said, her voice softer than her usual brisk tone. "They don't just follow strength, they follow instinct, and right now, their instincts are telling them something about you is different, whether that difference comes from magic, or simply from a heart that puts real care into everything it touches. Either way, that kind of attention doesn't fade easily, and it doesn't always stay harmless." "I never wanted this kind of attention," Mira admitted, frustration creeping into her voice for the first time since her arrival. "I only wanted to survive, to earn my place quietly." "Quiet isn't an option anymore," Grace said, not unkindly. "Not with raiders asking questions about you near the border, and not with half the pack convinced you're something more than an ordinary cook. You need to decide how you want to handle what's coming, because it's coming, regardless of what you want." Mira absorbed the warning in silence, understanding the truth in Grace's words even as she wished desperately that things could remain as simple as they had been during her first uncertain weeks in the kitchen. She thought of Draven, of the quiet evenings they had shared by the fire, of the strange comfort she had found in his company, despite every reason she had to remain guarded. She wondered if that comfort would survive whatever storm was gathering on the horizon, or if it too would burn away like everything else she had once believed safe. That evening, Draven finally returned, later than usual, exhaustion evident in the tight set of his shoulders and the shadows beneath his eyes. He sat near the fire without speaking, for several long minutes, accepting the bowl Mira offered with a quiet nod of thanks, before eating in heavy silence. "You've heard about the scouts," he said finally, not looking up from the fire. "Yes," Mira answered. "They're the same pack that attacked Ashwell," Draven continued, his voice carrying a controlled anger that Mira had not heard from him before. "My trackers confirmed it this afternoon. They've been circling our borders for nearly a week, gathering information rather than attacking directly." "Information about what?" Mira asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. Draven finally met her eyes, and the look he gave her carried both concern and something fiercer, something protective that surprised her with its intensity. "About you," he said simply. "They know you survived. They know you're here, and from what my trackers have gathered, they intend to demand your return, framing you as a thief who escaped justice rather than a survivor who escaped violence. Mira felt the floor seem to shift beneath her, old fear rising up alongside a new, sharper anger at the injustice of being painted as a criminal for the crime of surviving her own village's destruction. "What will you do?" she asked quietly. Draven's expression hardened, the exhaustion in his features giving way to something colder and more resolute. "I will not hand you over," he said, each word deliberate and final. "Whatever claim they believe they have, whatever lies they intend to tell, you are under my protection now." "That will not change." Mira stared at him, surprised by the certainty in his voice, the complete absence of hesitation, in a decision that could easily draw his entire pack into conflict with a dangerous enemy. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why protect someone who brings you nothing but trouble?" Draven was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Because you've brought my pack something they haven't had in a long time," he said finally. "Comfort, trust, a reminder that not everything requires guarding against. I won't let that be taken from them, or from you, without a fight." Mira did not know how to respond to such an admission. Her heart caught somewhere between fear for what was coming and a warmth she had not expected to feel amid such danger. She simply nodded, accepting his protection with a gratitude too large for words, while outside the walls of Blackthorn Keep, the enemy that had already taken everything from her once began drawing closer, determined to finish what they had started on the night Ashwell burned. A horn sounded from the watchtower, 3 sharp blasts that sent every wolf in the courtyard scrambling into formation, and Mira dropped the basket of vegetables she carried without noticing it spill across the stones. 3 blasts meant visitors approaching under a banner of parley, not attack, but the tension that gripped the keep felt just as sharp as if war had already arrived at the gates. Word spread quickly through the corridors that the rival pack, the same raiders who had burned Ashwell to the ground, had sent a formal delegation demanding audience with the Alpha King. Mira's hands shook as she made her way toward the main hall, drawn by a mixture of dread and the desperate need to know what was happening, rather than wait blindly in the kitchen. Grace tried to stop her at the doorway, warning her that showing her face might only provoke the situation further, but Mira could not bring herself to hide while her own fate was being decided in a room just beyond her reach. She arrived at the edge of the great hall, in time to see the delegation enter. 3 wolves, dressed in the dark red colors she remembered with sickening clarity, from the night her village burned. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, walked with the confident swagger of someone accustomed to getting what he demanded through intimidation alone. "Victor Kane," Draven said from his seat at the head of the hall, his voice carrying none of the warmth Mira had grown familiar with during their quiet evenings by the fire. This was a different version of him entirely, cold and unyielding, every inch the Alpha King his reputation described. "You've traveled far to stand in my hall uninvited." "I come with a simple request, Ashcroft," Victor said, his voice smooth, despite the threat lurking beneath his words. "A thief from my territory has taken shelter within your walls. I ask that you return her to face justice for crimes committed against my pack." "Crimes," Draven repeated, his tone sharpening dangerously. "I've heard a different account of what happened to Ashwell. One involving fire, unprovoked attack, and the deaths of innocent villagers who owed your pack nothing." Victor's expression flickered with something that might have been irritation, quickly smoothed back into practiced calm. "Territorial disputes are rarely simple, Ashcroft. Regardless of the details, the girl in question stole valuable resources from my pack before fleeing. I have every right to reclaim what belongs to me." Mira felt sick hearing herself discussed, as though she were property to be reclaimed, rather than a person who had lost everything to this man's violence. She pressed herself further into the shadows near the hall's entrance, unwilling to be seen, though every instinct screamed at her to step forward and demand the truth be spoken aloud. "I've met the girl you speak of," Draven said, his voice carrying an edge that made several of the assembled wolves shift uneasily. "She arrived here with nothing but the clothes she wore and grief for a family she watched die. I find it difficult to believe such a person stole anything of value from a pack capable of burning an entire village to ash." Victor's jaw tightened, the first crack in his composed exterior. "Are you calling me a liar in my own audience, Ashcroft?" I'm stating what I've observed, Draven replied evenly, and what I've observed does not align with your version of events. The tension in the hall grew thick enough that Mira could feel it pressing against her chest, even from her hidden position near the entrance. Victor's companions shifted closer to him, hands resting near weapons at their belts, though no one had yet crossed the line into open aggression. I did not travel this distance to be refused, Victor said, his voice dropping into something colder and more dangerous. Hand over the girl, Ashcroft, and this matter ends peacefully. Refuse, and you may find that Blackthorn's borders are not as secure as you believe them to be. The threat hung in the air, unmistakable despite its careful phrasing. Mira watched Draven's expression carefully, searching for any hint of hesitation, any sign that the pressure of Victor's implicit warning might change his resolve. Instead, she saw only a deepening resolve, his posture straightening, as though preparing for exactly the kind of confrontation Victor seemed to be threatening. The girl you seek is under my protection, Draven said, his voice ringing clearly through the hall, loud enough that every wolf present, and Mira herself hidden near the doorway, heard the declaration without any possibility of misunderstanding. She is a member of my pack now, and I do not surrender what belongs to Blackthorn, regardless of threats made against my borders. A ripple moved through the assembled wolves at the declaration, quiet murmurs and exchanged glances that Mira did not fully understand in the moment, though she noticed Colin Marsh exchange a meaningful look with Owen Vance near the side of the hall. Something about Draven's specific choice of words, member of my pack, seemed to carry weight beyond simple diplomatic phrasing, though Mira could not identify exactly why. Victor's expression darkened further at the refusal, his hand curling into a fist at his side. You will regret this decision, Ashcroft, he said, his voice low and venomous. Blackthorn is strong, but no pack stands invulnerable forever. Test that theory if you wish, Draven replied, unmoved by the threat. But know that any attempt against my walls, or against anyone sheltering within them, will be met with the full strength of this pack. I do not make idle warnings. Victor held his gaze for a long, tense moment, before finally turning on his heel, his companions falling into step behind him as they exited the hall without further ceremony. The heavy doors closed behind them with a resounding thud that seemed to echo through the sudden silence left in their wake. The hall remained quiet for several seconds after their departure, the assembled wolves processing what had just occurred, before conversation slowly began to build back into its usual volume. Mira remained frozen near the entrance, overwhelmed by everything she had witnessed, the danger of Victor's threats mixing uncomfortably with the strange, unexpected warmth she felt at Draven's fierce and public declaration of protection. She did not notice Draven approaching until he stood directly in front of her, his expression softening slightly from the hardened authority he had shown Victor moments before. You heard all of that, he said, not quite a question. Yes, Mira admitted, her voice quieter than she intended. Thank you for defending me the way you did. Draven studied her for a long moment, something complicated passing behind his eyes. I meant every word, he said. You are under my protection, and Victor Kane will find that threatening you comes at a cost he is not prepared to pay. Won't this bring war to your doorstep? Mira asked, guilt creeping into her voice at the thought of an entire pack potentially suffering because of her presence within their walls. Perhaps, Draven admitted honestly. But some things are worth defending, regardless of the cost involved. I have learned, through hard experience, which battles matter and which do not. This one matters. Mira felt something shift inside her chest at his words, a warmth that had nothing to do with fear or gratitude alone, something deeper and more complicated that she was not yet ready to name. She thought of the quiet evenings by the fire, the fierce declaration he had just made in front of his entire pack, and wondered how much further this strange, unexpected connection between them might grow before the storm gathering beyond Blackthorn's walls finally broke. Later that evening, as she prepared the nightly meal with hands still unsteady from the day's events, Grace approached her with an expression Mira had never seen on the older woman's face before, something between concern and cautious hope. Do you understand what he said today? Grace asked quietly. Calling you a member of his pack, in front of Victor Kane and half the wolves of Blackthorn? I assumed it was simply a way of asserting his protection, Mira said, though a small part of her had wondered about the deeper significance she noticed in the reactions of those around her. Grace shook her head slowly. Among wolves, that phrase carries weight beyond simple protection. It's a formal claim, Mira. One that ties your fate to this pack in ways that go beyond employment or shelter. Whether he realizes the full implication of what he said, or whether he chose those words deliberately, I cannot say. But you should understand what you may be stepping into before this goes any further. Mira absorbed the warning with a mixture of confusion and quiet unease, uncertain what exactly Draven's declaration meant for her future, but increasingly aware that whatever was growing between them had already moved beyond anything she could easily walk away from, even if the danger surrounding them continued to grow with each passing day. Draven woke in the middle of the night with his heart pounding and his claws already extended, some instinct deep inside him screaming that danger stood far too close for comfort, though the room around him remained empty and still. He sat up in the darkness, breathing hard, trying to make sense of the sudden panic that had torn him from sleep. His wolf paced restlessly beneath his skin, agitated in a way it had not been for weeks, ever since Mira's soup had begun offering it the rare comfort of calm evenings by the fire. Something had disturbed that fragile peace, though he could not immediately identify what. He rose and dressed quickly, following an instinct he did not fully understand toward the lower halls of the keep where the kitchen staff slept. He told himself he was simply checking on the safety of his pack after Victor Kane's visit, nothing more. But some deeper part of him recognized the destination his feet had chosen before his mind had consciously decided on it. He found the kitchen quiet and empty, the fire banked low for the night, everything exactly as it should have been. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, feeling foolish for the sudden urgency that had driven him from his bed, before finally allowing himself to acknowledge the true source of his unease. Mira's room was just beyond the kitchen, shared with two other workers, and though nothing appeared amiss, his wolf remained agitated, restless, in a way that would not settle until he confirmed with his own eyes that she remained safe within Blackthorn's walls. He found her the following morning in the kitchen as usual, moving through her tasks with the same tired efficiency she always showed, apparently unaware of the strange unease that had gripped him hours earlier. He watched her from the doorway for a moment, studying her carefully for any sign of distress, before finally stepping inside. "Is everything all right?" Mira asked, noticing his unusual scrutiny. "I'm not certain," Draven admitted, surprising himself with the honesty of the answer. "I woke last night with a strong sense that something had gone wrong, though I found nothing amiss when I checked the halls." Mira's brow furrowed with concern. "Do you think Victor Kane's people tried something?" "My guards reported no unusual activity along the borders," Draven said, though the unease had not fully left him despite the reassurance. It may have been nothing more than lingering tension from yesterday's confrontation. He did not tell her that his wolf had specifically driven him toward her section of the keep, unwilling to voice a suspicion he was not yet ready to examine fully himself. He had ruled for nearly a decade without allowing personal feeling to complicate his judgment, had built careful walls around his heart after the betrayal that nearly cost him everything years earlier. The idea that those walls might be cracking, slowly and without his permission, unsettled him more than any external threat Victor Kane could pose. That evening, as the pack gathered for their usual meal, Draven found himself once again seated near the fire, accepting the bowl Mira offered with a familiarity that had become almost second nature over the past weeks. He watched her move through the kitchen, noting details he had not consciously registered before, the careful way she checked on each wolf who seemed particularly tired or wounded, the patience she showed, even toward Edith Cole's continued unkindness, the quiet strength that had carried her through losses most people never had to face. "You're staring," Mira said, catching his gaze without looking up from the pot she stirred. Draven felt an unfamiliar warmth rise to his face, an embarrassment he had not experienced in longer than he could remember. "My apologies," he said, though he did not fully look away. "May I ask you something?" Mira said, setting down her ladle and turning to face him fully. "Of course. Why do you keep coming back here, every evening, when you have a hall full of servants who could easily bring your meals to your private quarters instead?" Draven considered the question carefully, aware that his answer might reveal more than he had intended to admit, even to himself. "I've asked myself that same question more than once," he said finally. "I tell myself it's simply about monitoring your soup's unusual effect on my pack, ensuring there's no hidden danger in something I still don't fully understand. But I think, if I'm honest, That explanation stopped being the true reason some time ago. Mira's breath caught slightly at the admission, her eyes searching his with a mixture of surprise and something that looked almost like hope. Then what is the true reason? She asked quietly. Draven held her gaze, feeling the careful walls he had maintained for years shift dangerously close to breaking entirely. I think, he said slowly, that my wolf has begun to recognize something in you that it does not want to lose. I did not expect this. I did not seek it. But I cannot deny it any longer. Not after last night. Not after the panic that drove me from my bed simply because some instinct told me you might be in danger. Mira stood frozen, absorbing the weight of his words, her heart pounding loud enough that she was certain he could hear it, despite the distance between them. What does that mean? She asked softly. For wolves, recognizing someone that way? It means my wolf has begun to consider you something more than a member of my pack, Draven said, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant, in a way that seemed foreign to a man who commanded absolute authority within these walls. It may mean the beginning of a bond, the kind wolves form only once, if they are fortunate enough to form it at all. Mira's mind raced through everything she had heard about wolf bonds during her time in Ashwell, fragments of stories her mother had told her about mates chosen, not through calculation, but through instinct, too powerful to ignore. She had never expected such a thing to apply to her, a girl with no bloodline worth mentioning, certainly not with a king who ruled over one of the strongest packs in the region. I don't know what to say, she admitted honestly. You don't need to say anything, Draven said gently. I only wanted you to understand why I keep returning here, evening after evening. It isn't obligation. It isn't simple caution anymore. Something in me has chosen you, Mira, whether either of us intended for that to happen or not. The kitchen felt suddenly smaller, the space between them charged with something neither had fully acknowledged until this moment. Mira felt the careful distance she had maintained since her arrival begin to soften, replaced by a warmth that frightened her with its intensity, given everything she had already lost to forces beyond her control. I'm afraid, she admitted quietly, not of you, of losing something else I've allowed myself to care about. I understand that fear better than you might realize, Draven said, stepping closer, though he stopped short of closing the remaining distance between them entirely. But I will not let Victor Kane, or anyone else, take away what has begun growing here. Whatever comes next, know that my protection over you was never simply duty. It has become something far more personal than that. Mira nodded, unable to find words adequate to the moment, though something in her chest had loosened, some fear she had carried since the night Ashwell burned finally beginning to ease in the presence of a man who had somehow, against every expectation she carried, become someone she trusted with pieces of herself she had not shared with anyone since her mother's death. Neither of them spoke further of the bond that evening, though the quiet understanding between them had shifted into something neither could easily deny any longer, a fragile beginning that would soon be tested by dangers neither had fully anticipated. Fire lit the night sky above the eastern wall, and the sound of the alarm horn tore through Blackthorn Keep with a violence that sent every wolf scrambling from their beds in a panic Mira had prayed she would never experience again. She was on her feet before she fully understood what was happening, old instincts from the night Ashwell burned driving her toward the door, before conscious thought caught up with her body. Ivy Marsh burst into the room moments later, her face pale in the dim light of the corridor torches. They're attacking the eastern wall, Ivy said, breathless. Victor Kane's pack, dozens of them, maybe more. The king has already called every able fighter to the walls. Mira's stomach dropped. She thought immediately of Draven, of Colin, of Owen, of everyone who had shown her kindness since her arrival at Blackthorn, all of them now rushing toward danger that existed only because Victor Kane wanted her returned to face punishment for surviving his own pack's violence. What should I do? Mira asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Grace is gathering the healers in the main hall, Ivy said. They'll need help treating wounds as the fighters come in. Can you assist? Yes, Mira said immediately, grateful for a way to help rather than simply hiding, while others fought a battle caused by her presence within these walls. The main hall had been transformed within minutes into a makeshift healing station, tables cleared of their usual formal settings and replaced with bandages, herbs, and basins of water. Grace directed the effort with brisk efficiency, calling out instructions to the handful of healers and volunteers who had gathered to help. The first wounded wolves arrived faster than Mira expected, carried in by comrades, or limping in under their own power, blood and mud mixing across torn clothing. She worked alongside Grace and the other healers, cleaning wounds, applying pressure to bleeding injuries, offering water to those too exhausted to fetch it themselves. The sounds from outside grew louder as the battle intensified, distant howls and the clash of weapons carrying even through the thick stone walls of the keep. Owen was among the wounded who arrived partway through the night, a deep gash along his forearm that he insisted was minor despite the blood soaking through the makeshift bandage he had wrapped around it himself. Mira cleaned the wound carefully, her hands steady despite the chaos surrounding her, applying the same patient care to his injury that she brought to every pot of soup she had ever made. "The king is holding the eastern gate himself," Owen said through gritted teeth as Mira worked. "Victor Kane came with more wolves than we expected." "It's bad out there, Mira." Fear gripped her chest at the mention of Draven fighting on the front lines, but she forced herself to focus on the immediate task in front of her, knowing that panic would help no one, least of all the wounded relying on her steady hands. "He's strong," she said, as much to reassure herself as Owen. "He'll hold the gate." The night stretched on in a blur of blood and exhaustion, wounded wolves arriving in a steady stream that never seemed to slow. Mira lost track of how many injuries she treated, how many hours passed, while the battle raged beyond the walls, her hands growing raw from constant work, but her focus never wavering. She thought of her mother, of the healing knowledge passed down through careful teaching rather than any magical gift, and found herself grateful for every lesson she had absorbed without realizing how valuable it would eventually become. A commotion near the hall's entrance drew her attention sometime near dawn, and her heart nearly stopped when she saw Colin Marsh carrying an unconscious form through the doorway, blood streaking across both their faces. It took her a horrified moment to recognize the still figure in Colin's arms as Draven himself, his usually commanding presence, reduced to something frighteningly fragile, a deep wound along his side soaking through his torn shirt. "He took a blade meant for one of the younger fighters," Colin said grimly, laying Draven carefully on the nearest clear table. "Wouldn't stop fighting even after he was hit, not until Victor Kane's forces began retreating." Mira's training took over before fear could paralyze her entirely, her hands moving with practiced efficiency to assess the wound, despite the panic clawing at her chest. The cut was deep, dangerously close to organs that could not survive significant damage, blood loss already visible in the pale cast of Draven's skin. "I need clean water, more bandages, and the yarrow root from the healing stores," Mira said, her voice carrying an authority she did not know she possessed until the words left her mouth. Grace, recognizing the urgency in her tone, moved immediately to gather what was needed without question. Mira worked with a focus that blocked out everything else in the chaotic hall, applying pressure to slow the bleeding, cleaning the wound as carefully as time allowed, packing it with herbs she remembered her mother using for similar injuries in Ashwell. Draven remained unconscious throughout her work, his breathing shallow but steady, a fact she clung to as reassurance while her hands continued their careful work. "Will he survive?" Colin asked, his usual composed demeanor cracked with worry as he watched Mira work. "I don't know," Mira admitted honestly, unwilling to offer false comfort in a moment that demanded truth. "But I'm doing everything I know how to do. The wound is deep, but it missed anything that would have killed him instantly. If we can keep the bleeding controlled and prevent infection, he has a chance." She continued working through the remaining hours of darkness, monitoring Draven's condition alongside the other wounded, who still required her attention, refusing to allow exhaustion or fear to compromise the careful precision her work demanded. Dawn eventually broke over Blackthorn Keep, painting the sky in soft colors that felt almost cruel, given the violence that had occurred beneath it only hours before. Reports filtered in throughout the morning, confirming that Victor Kane's forces had ultimately retreated, unable to break through Blackthorn's defenses despite their numbers, though the cost had been steep on both sides. Several wolves from Draven's pack had been lost during the night, others wounded seriously enough that their recovery remained uncertain, and Mira felt the weight of guilt pressing heavily against her chest, despite everyone's insistence that the attack was not her fault. "You didn't ask for this," Grace said firmly, when Mira voiced her guilt aloud during a brief pause in her work. Victor Kane chose violence. That choice belongs to him alone, not to you. Mira wanted to believe that completely, but the knowledge that an entire battle had been fought over her presence within these walls settled heavily, regardless of Grace's reassurance. She turned her attention back to Draven, still unconscious on the table where Colin had first laid him, and continued monitoring his condition with a vigilance that would not allow her to rest until she was certain he would survive. It was nearly midday when his eyes finally fluttered open, disoriented at first, before focusing on her face, hovering anxiously above him. "Mira," he said, his voice weak but clear, relief evident in his expression despite the pain that must have been coursing through his injured body. "Don't move," Mira said quickly, gently pressing him back down as he attempted to sit up. "You lost a great deal of blood. You need to rest." "Did we hold the gate?" Draven asked, his priorities immediately turning to his pack despite his own condition. "You held the gate," Mira confirmed, unable to keep the emotion from her voice. "Victor Kane's forces retreated. You saved everyone, even after you were wounded." Draven's expression softened as he studied her face, taking in what must have been the exhaustion and worry evident in her features after a night spent fighting to save his life alongside countless others. "You look terrible," he said, a weak attempt at humor that surprised a small, relieved laugh out of her, despite everything they had both endured. "You're one to talk," she replied, gently squeezing his hand where it rested near hers on the table. "Thank you," Draven said quietly, his gaze holding hers, with an intensity that had nothing to do with pain or exhaustion. "For everything you did tonight, for everyone you helped, for staying by my side when you could have hidden instead." "I couldn't have hidden even if I wanted to," Mira admitted honestly. "Not when it was your safety at stake." Draven's hand tightened gently around hers, a silent acknowledgement of everything neither of them had fully voiced yet, the bond that had begun forming between them now tested and strengthened by the violence of the night they had both survived. Around them, the keep slowly began the long process of recovery, tending wounds both physical and otherwise, while beyond the walls, Victor Kane retreated to lick his own wounds and plan whatever came next in a conflict that had already cost far more than either side had anticipated when it began. A knife clattered to the stone floor of the kitchen storeroom, and Mira froze at the sound, certain for one terrifying moment that Victor Kane's forces had somehow breached the keep's defenses, despite the guards posted at every entrance since the attack. Instead, she found Edith Cole standing frozen among the shelves, a small blade at her feet, and a look of guilty panic spreading across her face that told Mira immediately something was deeply wrong. "What are you doing?" Mira asked carefully, taking in the scene, the open storeroom door that should have been locked, the small pouch of herbs Edith had been in the process of hiding beneath her apron. "Nothing that concerns you," Edith said, though her voice lacked its usual sharp confidence, trembling instead with something closer to fear. Mira's eyes fell to the pouch, recognizing the distinctive purple flowers visible through the thin fabric, a poisonous herb her mother had taught her to identify and avoid during her childhood in Ashwell. "That's wolfsbane," Mira said slowly, understanding dawning with a cold, sick feeling. "Why do you have wolfsbane hidden in the kitchen stores?" Edith's composure finally cracked entirely, tears springing to her eyes as she sank against the shelves behind her. "They threatened my family," she whispered. "Victor Kane's people found my sister living outside the keep's walls, told me they would kill her unless I helped them get to the king, or to you." Mira's heart clenched with a complicated mixture of anger and reluctant sympathy, understanding all too well the desperate choices fear and love for family could drive a person toward. "What were you supposed to do with the wolfsbane?" she asked, keeping her voice as calm as she could manage, despite the danger of the situation. "Add it to your soup," Edith admitted, shame thick in her voice. "Small amounts, over time, weak enough not to be immediately noticed, but strong enough to eventually kill. They wanted the king dead, and they wanted it to look like your cooking had turned dangerous, so that even if their plan for poisoning failed to kill him outright, you would be blamed and removed regardless." The plan's cruelty struck Mira with sudden clarity, a scheme designed not only to eliminate Draven, but to destroy the trust that had grown between herself and the pack, to paint her as exactly the kind of dangerous outsider Edith herself had once accused her of being. "You have to tell the king," Mira said firmly. "He can protect your sister. Victor Kane's threats mean nothing once Blackthorn knows the truth." He'll have me executed for treason, Edith said, panic rising in her voice again. Not if you come forward now, before any harm is done, Mira said, though she could not fully promise an outcome that was not hers to guarantee. Draven values loyalty, but he also understands desperation. Hiding this will only make things worse. For you and for your sister both. Edith remained silent for a long, tense moment, clearly weighing impossible choices against each other, before finally nodding, tears still streaking down her face. Will you come with me? She asked quietly. I don't think I can face him alone. Mira agreed, and together, they made their way to Draven's private chambers, where he had been slowly recovering under Grace's watchful care over the preceding days. He listened to Edith's confession with a controlled expression that revealed little of his internal reaction, though Mira could see the tension building in his jaw as the full scope of Victor Kane's scheme became clear. Your sister's location, Draven said, once Edith finished speaking, his voice carrying authority, despite his still healing injury. Give my guards the details, and I will personally ensure her safety within these walls before Victor Kane can act on his threats. Edith looked up in stunned disbelief. You're not going to punish me? You came forward before any harm was done, Draven said. That matters more to me than the mistake itself. Had you followed through with this plan, the consequences would be different. But I understand fear for family better than most, and I will not add to Victor Kane's cruelty by punishing someone he manipulated through threats against an innocent person. Relief flooded Edith's expression, followed quickly by genuine shame as she turned toward Mira. I'm sorry, she said quietly, for everything, not just this. I treated you unfairly from the moment you arrived, and you still helped me when you had every reason not to. We've all made choices out of fear, Mira said simply. I understand better than most. The confession, though troubling in its revelation of how close disaster had come to Blackthorn's walls, ultimately strengthened rather than weakened the trust building throughout the pack. Word spread of Mira's role in uncovering the plot, of her insistence on mercy for Edith despite the danger the woman had nearly caused, and the lingering suspicion some pack members had held toward the outsider from Ashwell finally began to fade entirely. Draven's recovery continued steadily over the following days, his strength gradually returning under Mira's careful attention and the healing herbs she prepared alongside his meals. Their evenings by the fire resumed once he was well enough to leave his chambers, though now the quiet comfort between them carried an openness neither bothered to disguise any longer. Victor Kane will not stop with poison and threats, Draven said one evening, his expression thoughtful as he watched the fire crackle before them. The plot's failure will only push him toward more direct action. I expect he'll attempt another assault, likely sooner rather than later, now that he knows subtlety has failed him. Are we prepared for that? Mira asked, worry creasing her brow. More prepared than before, Draven said. The last attack taught us his force's capabilities, and Edith's confession has given us insight into his methods beyond simple combat. We will be ready. Mira nodded, though the prospect of further violence settled uneasily in her chest despite Draven's confidence. She thought of everything the pack had already sacrificed defending her, the wounded still recovering throughout the keep, the lives lost during the Eastern Wall's defense, and wondered how much more would be required before Victor Kane's obsession with reclaiming her finally ended. I could leave, she said quietly, voicing a fear she had carried since the first attack. If my presence continues to bring this kind of danger to your pack, perhaps it would be safer for everyone. If I simply disappeared somewhere, Victor Kane could never find me. Draven's expression turned fierce immediately, his hand finding hers with a firmness that left no room for misunderstanding. You will not leave, he said, his voice carrying the same absolute certainty he had shown Victor Kane during their first confrontation. Running would not end this conflict, Mira. Victor Kane wants more than simply your return at this point. He wants to prove that Blackthorn can be broken, that I can be humiliated in front of every pack watching our borders. Your leaving would not stop that ambition. It would only mean facing it alone, unprotected, exactly as he hopes. Mira absorbed his words, understanding the truth in them, even as guilt continued to weigh against her chest. Then what do we do? She asked. We finish what he started, Draven said, resolve hardening his features. Together, as a pack, and as whatever we have become to each other beyond that. I will not lose you to fear, mine or yours, not after everything we've already survived to reach this point. Mira felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by the fierce devotion in his words, by the certainty of a bond she had never expected to find again, after losing everything in Ashwell's fire. She squeezed his hand in return, silently promising to face whatever came next by his side, rather than running from it, regardless of the danger still gathering beyond Blackthorn's walls. Neither of them knew, in that quiet moment by the fire, exactly how soon Victor Kane's next move would come, or how decisively the coming confrontation would finally settle the conflict that had begun the night Ashwell burned to the ground. The ground shook beneath a battering ram striking the western gate, and this time there was no warning horn, no formal delegation, only the sudden violence of Victor Kane's forces attempting to break through Blackthorn's defenses under cover of a moonless night. Mira woke to shouting, and the distant sound of splintering wood, her body moving before conscious thought fully caught up. Years of instinct honed since the night Ashwell burned, driving her toward action rather than paralysis. She dressed quickly and made her way toward the main hall, already anticipating the wounded that would soon require her attention. Grace met her at the entrance, her face grim with the seriousness of the situation. This attack is different, Grace said, as they hurried to prepare the healing station. Victor Kane brought everything he has this time. Colin says it's nearly triple the numbers from the last assault. Mira's stomach twisted at the news, thoughts immediately turning to Draven, still not fully recovered from his previous injury, now facing an even larger assault than the one that had nearly killed him weeks before. Is the king fighting? She asked, though she already suspected the answer. He wouldn't stay behind, Grace confirmed, not with the western gate under this kind of pressure. The sounds of battle grew louder as the night progressed, the western gate finally giving way under the relentless assault, forcing Blackthorn's defenders into a desperate fight within the outer courtyard itself. Wounded began arriving at the healing station in numbers far exceeding the previous attack, the severity of injuries reflecting the increased ferocity Victor Kane had brought to this final assault. Mira worked without pause, her hands moving through familiar motions of cleaning wounds and stopping bleeding, though the sheer volume of injuries stretched even her growing skill to its limits. Ivy arrived among the wounded, partway through the night, a deep bite wound along her shoulder that she insisted on having treated quickly so she could return to the fight, a request Mira reluctantly honored despite her concerns about the young wolf's condition. The king is holding the courtyard, Ivy reported as Mira worked, pain evident in her voice despite her attempts to remain composed. But Victor Kane himself has entered the fight now. He's targeting the king directly. Fear seized Mira's chest at the news, memories of Draven's near-fatal injury from the previous battle, rising unbidden in her mind. She finished treating Ivy's wound as quickly as safety allowed, sending the young wolf back into the fight with strict instructions to seek further treatment if the wound reopened, before turning her attention to the growing line of wounded still awaiting her care. The battle raged for hours, the outcome uncertain as reports filtered into the healing hall through wounded fighters and messengers relaying updates from the courtyard. Mira lost track of time entirely, her focus narrowed to the immediate task of keeping wounded wolves alive long enough to see the battle's resolution, whatever that resolution might ultimately be. It was Colin who finally arrived with news that changed everything, bursting into the hall with an urgency that immediately silenced the quiet murmur of activity throughout the healing station. The king is wounded again, Colin said, breathless from running. Badly this time. Victor Kane caught him with a blade meant to kill, and he's still fighting despite the injury, but he won't last much longer without proper treatment. Mira's blood ran cold at the news, but rather than the paralysis of fear, she felt something sharper take hold, a fierce determination that pushed aside every instinct urging her to remain safely within the healing hall. "Take me to him," she said firmly. "It's not safe out there," Colin warned, though his expression suggested he understood the futility of trying to stop her. "I don't care," Mira said. "I'm not losing him the way I lost everyone else." "Take me to him now." Colin led her through the chaotic courtyard, the battle still raging in pockets throughout the space. Wolves locked in combat beneath torchlight that cast dancing shadows across the violence. They found Draven near the center of the fighting, blood soaking through his shirt from a wound along his ribs, still standing despite injuries that would have felled a lesser fighter, locked in combat with Victor Kane himself. Mira watched in horror as the two leaders exchanged blows, Draven's movements growing visibly slower as blood loss took its toll. Victor Kane pressing his advantage with the confidence of someone who sensed victory within reach. She could not simply stand by and watch him fall, not after everything they had survived together, not when there might still be something she could do. Her eyes fell on a small vial at her belt, herbs she had prepared earlier that evening for treating wounds during the battle, a concentrated mixture that could numb pain and slow bleeding when applied directly. It would not win the fight for Draven, but it might buy him the seconds he needed to turn the tide against an opponent who had already sustained his own injuries throughout the long night of combat. "Draven," Mira called out, drawing his attention for just a moment, enough time to throw the vial toward him with careful aim. He caught it without fully understanding her intention, though instinct guided his hand to break the vial against his wounded side, the herbs within immediately taking effect, numbing the worst of his pain and slowing the blood loss that had been steadily weakening him throughout the fight. The brief moment of distraction cost Victor Kane his advantage, and Draven, suddenly finding renewed strength, pressed forward with an intensity that finally began overwhelming his opponent's defenses. The fight that followed was brutal and swift, years of Draven's discipline and training finally overcoming Victor Kane's brute aggression, until the rival leader found himself disarmed and pinned, his forces around the courtyard beginning to falter as their leader's defeat became apparent to everyone watching. "Yield," Draven demanded, his voice carrying across the courtyard despite his exhaustion and injury. "Or die here tonight, Kane. The choice is yours." Victor Kane, recognizing the hopelessness of his position, finally lowered his remaining weapon, defeat etched into every line of his face. "This isn't finished, Ashcroft," he spat, though the words carried little of their earlier venom. "It is finished," Draven said firmly. "Your forces are broken. Your claim against Mira was built on lies from the beginning. Leave Blackthorn's territory and do not return, or the mercy I'm showing you tonight will not be extended a second time." Victor Kane's remaining forces, seeing their leader defeated and disarmed, began retreating from the courtyard, the battle finally drawing to its exhausted conclusion as dawn began breaking over the horizon. Mira rushed to Draven's side the moment the immediate danger passed, her hands already assessing the extent of his injuries with the same careful precision she had shown throughout the long night. "You're a fool for throwing yourself into danger like that," Draven said, though gratitude softened the words considerably as she began treating his wounds. "You're one to talk," Mira replied, echoing his own words from weeks earlier with a small, exhausted smile. "Now hold still, before you bleed out after surviving an entire battle." Draven allowed her to work, his hand finding hers even as she tended his injuries, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had both risked and survived to reach this moment. Around them, Blackthorn's forces began the slow process of recovery, tending their own wounds and beginning repairs to the damaged western gate, while the threat that had hung over the keep since the night Ashwell burned finally, decisively, came to an end. "It's over," Draven said quietly, watching the sun rise fully over the courtyard, illuminating the scars of battle that would need time to heal, but no longer carried the weight of ongoing danger. "It's over," Mira agreed, relief flooding through her exhausted body as she finished securing the bandages around his wound. "We survived it together." Draven's hand tightened gently around hers, and though neither spoke further in that quiet moment, the understanding between them had solidified into something neither intended to let go of easily, a bond forged not simply through instinct or circumstance, but through every choice they had made to protect and trust each other, despite every reason fear might have given them to remain guarded instead. 3 weeks after the battle that finally ended Victor Kane's threat against Blackthorn, a summons echoed through the keep, calling every wolf to gather in the main hall, and Mira's hands trembled slightly as she untied her apron for what felt like the first time in longer than she could remember. She had spent the weeks since the battle helping tend to the wounded, watching Draven's own injuries heal steadily under her careful attention, and slowly settling into a version of life at Blackthorn that finally felt less like survival and more like something worth calling home. The kitchen staff had grown warmer toward her with each passing day. Even Edith, whose sister now lived safely within the keep's walls under Draven's continued protection, greeting her each morning with genuine friendliness rather than the suspicion of earlier weeks. But she had not expected a formal summons, and as she made her way toward the main hall alongside the rest of the gathering pack, uncertainty settled heavily in her chest, despite the peace the previous weeks had finally brought. The hall was full by the time she arrived, every member of Blackthorn's pack present, their attention focused on Draven, who stood at the head of the room, looking stronger and healthier than she had seen him since before the final battle, his injuries fully healed, his posture carrying the full authority of the Alpha King, rather than the vulnerability of a wounded man recovering by the fire. He caught her eye as she entered, and something in his expression, warm and certain, eased the anxiety that had been building since she first heard the summons. Colin guided her gently toward the front of the hall, and Mira found herself standing before the entire pack, uncertain what was expected of her but trusting, somehow, that whatever came next would not bring the kind of danger she had faced so many times before. 3 months ago, Draven began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. A girl arrived at our gates with nothing but grief for a lost home, and a skill for cooking she did not know would change the course of everything that followed. She came to us as a stranger, uncertain of her place, uncertain even of her own worth, beyond simple survival. Mira felt heat rise to her cheeks, as every eye in the hall turned toward her, though she found she did not want to look away, not when Draven's gaze held hers with such open warmth. She did not ask for the attention her cooking brought her, Draven continued. She did not seek out danger, or conflict, or the weight of an entire pack's growing affection, and yet, through nothing more than patience and genuine care, she gave this pack something we had been missing for far too long, a reminder that strength does not always come from battle, that comfort and trust can heal wounds that weapons cannot touch. He stepped down from the raised platform where he usually addressed the pack, crossing the distance between them until he stood directly in front of her, close enough that Mira could see the sincerity in his expression without any doubt remaining about what he intended to say next. When Victor Kane demanded her return, I refused, not simply out of duty to protect a member of my pack, but because my wolf had already recognized something in her that I was not willing to lose, Draven said, his voice softening, even as it continued to carry through the silent hall. That recognition has only grown stronger through everything we have survived together, through battles fought and wounds healed, through quiet evenings that taught me trust could exist, even after everything I believed had closed that possibility for good. He reached for her hand, and Mira let him take it, her heart pounding as the entire pack watched the moment unfold, with expressions ranging from joyful anticipation to quiet approval. Mira Hale, Draven said, you came to Blackthorn with nothing, believing you had little to offer beyond simple soup made from scraps and memory. But you have given this pack far more than nourishment. You have given us healing, trust, and a reminder that even the strongest walls benefit from softness within them. I am asking you, in front of everyone who calls this keep home, to accept not just my protection, but my bond as your mate, and to stand beside me as this pack's queen. Tears filled Mira's eyes, overwhelming emotion rising from a place she had guarded carefully since the night she lost everything in Ashwell's fire. She thought of her mother, of the lessons passed down through simple, patient cooking, of everything that had led her, against every unlikely circumstance, to this moment, standing before an entire pack that had somehow become her family, despite every fear that had told her such belonging was no longer possible for someone who had lost so much. Yes, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaking her face. Yes, I accept. The hall erupted into cheers, the assembled wolves celebrating the union, with a warmth that left no doubt about how thoroughly Mira had earned her place among them. No longer the stray Colin had once escorted through the gates with uncertain hope, but a chosen member of the pack, whose quiet strength had proven itself through every trial the past months had brought. Draven pulled her close, and in that moment, surrounded by the pack that had become her home, and the man who had become her chosen mate, Mira finally allowed herself to fully release the fear she had carried since the night everything burned. She had lost her first home to violence and grief, but she had found something unexpected in its place, a new home, built not on the fear of losing everything again, but on the quiet, steady trust that some bonds, once formed through genuine care and shared survival, could not be broken by any threat that might still lie beyond the horizon. In the years that followed, stories would be told throughout the region about Blackthorn's queen, the girl who arrived with nothing but a gift for simple cooking and left an unmistakable mark on an entire pack through nothing more than patience, kindness, and the quiet courage to keep giving warmth to others, even after losing everything herself. The kitchens of Blackthorn Keep continued to fill each evening with the same comforting aroma that had first drawn wolves to her counter months before, a tradition Mira never abandoned even after assuming her new role, because she understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the simplest gestures of care often held the power to heal what even the strongest walls could not protect against alone. And every evening, without fail, Draven Ashcroft found his way back to that same kitchen, not out of duty or lingering suspicion, but out of a love that had grown steadily from careful evenings by the fire into something neither of them had expected to find again after the losses that had shaped them both, a bond as enduring and quietly powerful as the soup that had first brought them together.